We're talking today with Dave Thrasher of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Dave, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born on the 19th of May, 1953 in Detroit, Michigan.
Okay, and did you grow up in Detroit or did you move around?
I spent my first 7 years in Detroit. When I was 3, my father passed away, and then at 7, my mom remarried. Then we moved to Iron Mountain, Michigan, because that's where he was from.
Okay.
And we were up there until I was 10, because unlike what people think today, businesses were moving out of this country even back then. The only 2 businesses in that area were the foundry and the Ford plant. They both moved to Canada. So my stepdad moved back to Detroit. Once he found a job, we relocated back there until I went into service.
Okay, and did you graduate from high school?
Yes, I graduated Holy Redeemer High School in Detroit, Michigan.
And what year?
1971.
Okay, and then what did you do after you got out of high school?
I went to work at Cadillac Body Plant, Detroit, Michigan.
Okay, now you're doing this at a time when the Vietnam War is going on and there's a draft going on. How much attention were you paying to that?
I paid quite a bit because I had several cousins that were over there. I basically come from a military family. And in fact, at that time, I had 5 cousins that were actually in country.
Okay.
So I did pay a lot of attention.
All right. And did you consider at that point just going ahead and enlisting, or were you just going to take your chances and see what happened?
At that point, I was kind of undecided. Having the military family background, you know, one side of me's thinking, but I'm also thinking, you know, I do have some relatives over there, and maybe I should wait. But then when the last draft lottery had me going anyway, I sat down and thought about it, and I talked with my stepdad, and we figured that, you know, if I'm going in, I might as well do it myself so I can get something out of it.
Okay.
Not just be a grunt for 2 years.
All right. So when did you make that decision?
I actually made that decision in November of '72.
Okay.
And then I was still working at the factory at that time, and I started the process of going on a leave of absence. Then I spoke with all 4 service recruiters, and the Marine Corps recruiter was the most fair of the bunch.
Okay, and what do you mean by that?
He didn't try to sell a bill of goods like a used car salesman. He basically asked me a few questions. He asked me if, you know, if I had any family in the military, and I told him yes. He didn't ask specifics, and he pulled out information on the Marine Air Wing and the Marine Ground side and had me go through it, and he said, if you have any questions, ask. And then, so I told him, I said, I would like to go in the Air Wing, and he says, the only thing I can do is I can guarantee you the Air Wing on the contract. What job you end up with is entirely up to you. You have to earn it.
Okay.
And that's what did it.
All right, but you can go in knowing at that point that you're not going to be a ground pounder,
Right.
at least. Okay. All right, so you've signed that up. Now, when do you actually start training?
Well, I actually took the oath in Marine Corps Reserve on the 30th of April, 1973. That gave me time to get my home situation taken care of, my stuff in storage and all that. And I actually went to boot camp on the 9th of July, 1973.
Okay, and where did you go for that training?
Marine Corps Recruit Training Depot, San Diego, California.
All right. Now, how do they get you out there?
They flew us from the Detroit Metro. We flew nonstop from Detroit to LA, and then there was a connecting flight from LA to San Diego. And then when we got off the plane, there's a bus waiting for us that took us right to boot camp.
Okay, and what time of day did you show up?
I put my feet on those yellow footprints at what the military would say, oh, dark 30 in the morning. It was like 3 in the morning.
Okay, because that does seem to be a tradition that they had to bring people in the middle of the night. Well, at least it had been in the Vietnam era generally. Almost everyone I've talked to did that.
I think part of that, especially during Vietnam, was I think because it was so much anti, they wanted to avoid issues. Let's get them in quietly and get things going so they don't have to deal with all the outside in.
All right. So what happens to you now? The bus pulls into the depot. Now what happens?
You get your first indoctrination to the drill instructor when this sergeant or staff sergeant, or in some cases corporal, comes on board, and basically, if you've ever seen movies like the DI or Tribe where they come on, start yelling, yes, they do.
Mm-hmm.
And you're on the yellow footprints, and they do a head count, and they make sure everybody showed up, that nobody disappeared, and then they take you to the barracks. That early in the morning, they just take you to the barracks, and then come about 8 o'clock the next morning, everything starts.
Mm-hmm.
You get started fitting for your uniforms. You form up your platoon, because they have a starting number. Then 4 platoons form into a series, and then you have 3 series. You have a first, second, and third series. And what they do is it's teaching you working together, but it's also teaching you competition, because each platoon competes against each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, how much time do they spend just with the processing stuff?
It's kind of an ongoing thing, because they start your physical training, they kind of mix it in the early days, so you're not doing all just one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to get you rounded into the military way of life.
Okay. But there's the head shaving, and are there?
Oh, that's immediately that first morning.
Yeah. Okay. Now, do they have you take tests and things at this point?
Yes. And what they do is, based on those tests, is where they'll place you when you leave boot camp. And it doesn't matter whether it's ground side or air wing. The test will give them a kind of a starting point.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, and now they get you past all of the initial haircutting and uniforms and this kind of thing. What does the boot camp then consist of?
Well, it consists of physical training. It consists of rifle qualifications, because Marine policy, every Marine is a rifleman.
Mm-hmm.
Rifle qualifications. They teach you how to defend yourself. They have what's called bugle sticks, that's teaching you how to use the rifle as a bayonet, with the bayonet on it. They teach that stuff because the first thing they're going to tell you is, I'm training you to come home. Marine Corps has always had this policy, as small as an organization is we don't want you dying for your country. Let the enemy die for his. You come home. So one of the theories was that drill instructors were so hard that you'd survive, or when you got in combat, you'd get out on the enemy, that what the drill instructor did to you. But it was all designed to keep you as safe as possible, get you through as much as they can, both physical and mental, to prepare you for what might happen. It may not happen, but they wanted to prepare you as much as they could.
Okay. And how did they go about instilling discipline?
Marching. If you messed up, then you did push-ups, or if it was a platoon thing, you might go out and do, instead of a 3-mile run, maybe it's a 6-mile run. Something what they would do is, if one person messed up, there were times they would punish the whole platoon, and it wasn't for you to gang up on the one guy. It was to maybe help him get better, or maybe this guy needed. We started out with a platoon of 72. And at one point, we were down only 60 guys that had either dropped out or things happened, some good, some not so good.
Would some people get hurt just in the process?
Yes, that does happen. It's not as common as what, like, the news media would try and portray. I'm not talking like public broadcasting, but back then, of course, there was more anti-military. Mm-hmm. So anytime anything happened, it would make it bigger news than what it probably was. But you also had the case, we had one guy in our platoon, was the only one in the whole series on pre-qual day to go unqualified. And when he was confronted in front of the squad bay, he basically told the drill instructor that That's not why God sent them. He sent them to join the Marine Corps to change their evil ways. And then we never saw that guy again. We don't know what it, but the drill instructor figured there's definitely something not right up there. And that's one of the things they're trying to weed out. You know, you don't want somebody that got problems like that. I mean, it could develop later on, but here this guy's starting this right away. So whether he was admin discharged or whether maybe he was sent for some reviews and then maybe come to another unit later, I don't know. They don't really tell us those things.
Okay. Now, did you pick up anybody along the way who would maybe
Yes.
had trouble earlier and then get
Yeah,
added?
we actually had a gentleman join our unit. He had gone UA. He had actually left the base in the middle of his training. He had actually gone back home and was living there, had actually gotten married. And he sat down one day and realized, you know what, one of these days they're going to catch me. Then I'm going to be in jail. So he talked to his wife, his parents, her parents, and decided to come back. So after he came back, because they reviewed the case, I mean, he came right back to the base and turned himself in. Mm-hmm. They reviewed the case, they interviewed him, and they let him finish boot camp, and he joined the platoon I was in, because that's where we were at training was when he left. Mm-hmm. And from what I gathered, he spent another 15 years in the Marine Corps.
All right. Now, how long did the boot camp last?
Mine lasted 94 days, 10 hours, 20 minutes, and 30 seconds. We actually asked it a few days longer because during that time, it was hard to get recruits because of the anti-war movement. Mm-hmm. So we actually spent an extra 4 days. And the rest of it was just basically from the time we landed on the yellow footprints to the time they put us on the bus to take us to the airport.
Okay. Now, how long did it take you for adjust to life in the military?
It did not take me as long as some others, but I did have family background from military, so it made it a little bit easier.
Okay. And were you in good physical shape when you went in?
Yes.
Okay. So you could survive the physical training and...
Yes, especially the running part, because part of the PFT test is you had to do a minimum of 3 pull-ups, 40 sit-ups, and you had to run the 3 miles in 28 minutes. The catch to that was the Marine Corps is smart. They don't want you doing the minimums. So they did a point system, and if you did just the minimums, you didn't pass. Mm-hmm. They wanted you to put out effort. They don't want you just to get by. The running part wasn't a problem because I ran track in high school.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And I guess during Vietnam, much of the time, there was sort of an 8-week boot camp, and then they would send people off to Camp Pendleton or whatever other training they were doing. Now, yours lasted more like 90 days.
Yes.
So what are they doing? Did you spend some time at Camp Pendleton as well?
Yes. For one, that's where the rifle range is, and 2, that's where they did some of the war games type thing between the different platoons. One platoon would be the unit on defense, another would be the aggressor, and that's what they would do, and then you'd go back to San Diego.
Okay. Now, at this point, were you training, you had people heading for the air wing as well as the ground wing, and you're basically just all together at that point, all
Correct.
doing the same thing? Okay. Now, once you complete that training, what do they do with you next?
Well, once you've graduated, of course, in quite a few of our cases, there was quite a few of us from the Detroit area, mm-hmm. and the only flight going out that day was almost immediately after boot camp, so our gear was put on the buses at like 5 in the morning, and as soon as the graduation was over, we were put on the bus and home. You were given 10 days of leave before you report to your next duty station. Mm-hmm. So the flight went from San Diego to Chicago, and once I got to Chicago, I was finally able to let my folks know I was coming home. Mm-hmm. I actually beat them to the Detroit airport from Chicago. Okay. And then from there, after the 10 days leave, you report to your next duty station. In my case, I had qualified high enough to go into the avionics field, aviation electronics. Mm-hmm. So my next duty station was NAS Millington, Tennessee.
Okay. And what did you do there?
There, I went through what they call AFAM and AMFU, that's Airframe Fundamentals, and that to learn the basics about airplanes. They don't assume you know anything. They start you at the beginning. And then I went through basic electricity and electronics schools, and then I went through aviation electronics Class A.
Okay. And how long did these schools add up to?
I reported there the second week of October of '73, and I left in May of '74.
Okay, so you got like about 7 months or 6, 7 months. Okay, at that time. All right. Now, what's life like while you're in these training schools?
One, the first couple weeks there, you're on Cinderella Liberty. It doesn't matter if your school started or if you're waiting for the class to start. Cinderella Liberty meant you had to be in by midnight, literally, or you were in trouble. And basically that was just to make sure you kind of got acclimated to the area. The other thing is you still had all the stuff to do in your barracks, the field days, the cleaning, the morning inspections and all that. So most of the time you're getting up about 5 in the morning, going to get breakfast, getting yourself ready. If you're somebody like me who has a thick beard, a lot of times I was shaving twice a day to get through the inspections in the morning, and then the class inspection at 1300. And then you would go to class. And then, of course, during those school times, you don't go like to the rifle range or anything like that because they want you to get the education they're paying you for. They're paying for. Get you educated so they can get you out into the fleet.
Okay. And what kind of mix of people were you training alongside?
I don't know, they're all green. One thing our drill instructor told us in boot camp, he said, you're not white, you're not black, you're not orange, you're not purple, you're green. All Marines are green. We had people from all over. In fact, there were people from other countries. And the classes weren't just Marines. There was also Navy. So there were blue people too.
Okay. All right. And did you get a sense of, kind of like just their backgrounds? Did you have people who'd been to college or things like that, or are they all pretty much young?
We had high school dropouts, we had college graduates, we had high school graduates, we had some that had some college time. Then there was somebody like me, I graduated high school, worked in a factory for 2 years, then there were people that had worked in offices. It was definitely a mixture.
Okay. Now, was all of your training geared toward fixed-wing aircraft, or was it adaptable for helicopters? Or?
What it is the schooling you go through in Memphis, whether you're going Navy or Marine, it was to get you all the basics so that you could work either way.
Okay.
And then once you got out into the Fleet Marine Force or into the Fleet Navy, there they would give you your basic schools for whichever type aircraft you ended up with.
Okay. So you're spending this 6 months plus doing this, and you still really don't know what you're going to do or where you're going to go.
Correct.
Okay. Now, once you've been there in the schools for a while, I guess you get beyond the Cinderella Liberty stage, so you can go off base a little more and do more things. Did you spend much time off base?
Yes, I did. One thing I learned from my relatives that were in the service, and one thing I learned the first couple weeks there, I would hear these guys, oh, there's nothing to do here, because Millington is kind of a little ways from Memphis. It's kind of out in the country, because it is an airfield, military airfield. And I would hear that, and I'm like, wait a minute, Memphis is down there. There's a history in that. So every chance I got. In fact, third day in, I actually got 24-hour Liberty. The third day we were there, we held formation, and they brought us into the classroom because we hadn't started classes yet. And they asked for volunteers to go into town to the Baptist Hospital to donate blood. Well, 3 of us did. After we did, they told us the duty vehicle's downstairs and you don't have to be back till 8 o'clock the next morning. Then, of course, everybody wanted to volunteer, but it was too late. So I took advantage anytime I could go into town. I went in Memphis a lot of times just to see it. It's someplace I'd never been before.
Okay. I mean, did you, go listen to music? Or
Sometimes I'd go to the bar just like anybody else. Sometimes I'd go to different bars because you'd get the Memphis beat, you'd get country, you go to this bar, it's rock and roll. This one over here was more the acid rock, and there's a little bit of everything you could find down there.
Okay. So you kind of took advantage of that. Now, did you ever have your own car down there? Or did
No,
you just
I did not.
use whatever transport was available?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now any other else about that experience in Millington that kind of stands out for you?
Not that I can think of. Just it was an experience. You're getting an education and meet a lot of different people. We met, like the story with the guy in boot camp. We had some incidents down there of things like that, and I'm thinking at that point, it's like, you're already through boot camp. How can this be any worse? But I didn't understand. But I think part of that was family background with military. I didn't think it was that bad.
All right. So now, what's your first duty station?
My first, well, what happened was,
what you do next? Yeah.
yeah, once we completed schools, and of course everybody, like the class I was in, the class that the guys for hydraulics was in, we didn't necessarily finish at the same time. So some of the guys I went to boot camp with and some of the guys I was there at Memphis with either had already left or were still there when I left. So I left in May. I was actually on leave, went home, attended an uncle's funeral, and then reported to Cherry Point Marine Corps Air Base, North Carolina, for school class assignments for what I was going to end up with. When I was there, the actual orders they had for me were for jets, but the orders were already overdue, so I couldn't take them. So I got to spend about 4 days there until new sets of orders came in. They called me in, and I was one of the rare ones that lucked out. They says, well, we got a set of orders you can have for the EA-6 or a set of orders for the CH-46. Well, I knew what an EA-6 was, but I'd never heard of a 46. And they said it was a helicopter. And that sounded more interesting, so I took those.
You know, the 46, I mean, that's a helicopter they had used in Vietnam
right,
much
quite
all the way through.
extensively.
Yeah.
And so then the orders were cut, and I left Cherry Point to report to Marine Corps Air Station New River Helicopter, which is down by Camp Lejeune.
Okay. So you're North Carolina. Okay. So now kind of describe what you do there.
When I reported into what they call TME 22, that's training group. Once you're there, then they assign you to different squadrons. And most of the time you would be assigned to the training squadron. It's called HMT 204. And there you would train on the aircraft. Now when I first went in, basically if you're an avionicsman or an aviation electrician, in the helicopter community, you were basically, it was basically open. You could train on the 46, but according to the regulations, you could work on the 46, the 53, the Huey, the Cobra, the OV-10, the C-130, the C-117 aircraft.
Okay.
The helicopters and the 3 fixed wing that were prop, not jets.
Right.
It was more of an open, because even though the 46 was so extensively used in Vietnam, helicopters were still kind of common ground. So I joined that squadron for training. Upon completion, now that was in May of '74, I completed that training in September and then was reassigned back to that squadron permanent personnel. So now I've done it. I've made it through all my schools. I'm now in the fleet.
All right. But you were assigned to the training squadron, or is this?
Yes.
Okay.
Because even though it's primarily training is for the crew chiefs, the pilots, that type of thing.
Okay.
Because when you first go to that training school, you don't necessarily end up there. You could have I could have ended up in one of the 53 outfits, because you have 2 groups there. You have Marine Aircraft Group 26 and Marine Aircraft Group 29, and they both have basically they're mirrors of each other. So if one group had to go off, you still had some there.
And in the meantime, the pilots and the aircrew, they're still training and all the time, and you're maintaining the aircraft.
Correct.
Okay. And so how long did you stay there?
I was actually, the one thing you kind of get used to is once you get in the fleet, sooner or later, you're going to end up either on guard duty or mess duty, and that's a 30-day detail. So in October, I only joined the unit permanent in September. Of course, October, I went on guard duty. 3rd week I was on guard duty, I got called from the barracks to report to S1. They handed me a set of orders for Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station, Hawaii.
Okay.
So I took the month of November off. They give you 30 days leave, and then fly over there. So I went home, spent it with the family, and little side note, I ran into somebody I'd met in high school. We kind of went downtown together to kind of do the Christmas thing, like through J.L. Hudson's. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Hudson's was still there when I first moved to Michigan. Yeah.
Yeah, well, they had that big store downtown where everything was on different floors and all decorated for the holidays, especially now that they're getting ready for the Christmas parade and all that. And the young lady I was with, we sat down for lunch, and she was talking about, we had met in high school, and she was talking about she had been on vacation in Maine visiting her aunt and uncle, and we hadn't seen each other since high school, but we were talking together, and she asked me if I knew of any good place to go for vacation. So I told her, why don't you go to Hawaii? And she asked me why. I said, and I told her this exactly. I said, well, I'll be there. That seems like a good reason. She later became my wife, my better half.
All right. Okay. So when you do go out to Hawaii, now are you basically a helicopter mechanic, or?
Yeah, helicopter aviation electronics. And when I got there, because the squadron had a shortage of personnel because they just had a big turnover, I ended up in a 53 squadron, HMH 463.
Okay. Just what's the difference between a 46 and a 53?
46 is a medium range, medium weight helicopter, has the tandem rotors. CH-53 is a heavy duty helicopter, has the Alphas and Deltas, which I started on, had 6 main rotor blades, 4 tail blades, and it could external load of about 20,000 pounds, and it could carry 33 combat troops inside. It was a lot bigger,
yeah,
a lot more powerful.
Okay. But you were familiar with those from your training already?
Well, the electronics were a lot similar.
Okay.
The electronic side, the radios, navigational, and all that. Electrical, you had to learn a little more because the wiring systems and stuff was a little bit different. And they actually sent me back to school for that. So I got to the squadron in December 1974. Got there about the middle of the month. Had my first green Christmas there, which was really weird. Growing up in Michigan, Christmases were always white. Here you are in Hawaii, and it's like 65 degrees out, you know, on the windward side of the island.
Okay. All right. And then kind of, so, and then you said they sent you to school. Did you do your schooling there?
No, they sent me to, back then it was called Santa Ana Marine Corps Base in California. Okay. And then it was called Tustin, but now it's closed down. But yeah, I went there for the school. They actually had schools at Tustin and El Toro, and I went through the school, and it basically was electrician school. Because I already had the comm nav part down, but if I'm going to be working, you got to be able to repair the wiring too.
Right.
So I had just finished school and got recalled back to the squadron.
Okay, and so when was that?
That would have been in the first week of March 1975.
Okay. Things are starting to get pretty interesting over in Southeast Asia by then.
Yes, that's why I got recalled. In fact, guys that were on leave we were all showing up back, and I reported back to my shop, and the first thing the NCOIC of the shop did was say, don't unpack.
So now what happens to you?
At the end of the month, they put us on board the USS Hancock, which was on our way from San Diego, and we headed towards the Philippines. The only problem is I had to call home and have my folks tell my girlfriend that not to come out. I might not be here. And my mom asked me where I was going. I said, well, we got orders to the Philippines. First thing she asked me was, is that near Vietnam? I said, no. I didn't know how close it was really, but I wasn't going to say anything to her. We had hunches, but nobody knew for sure. So they put us aboard the USS Hancock, an old World War II aircraft carrier. We left from Hawaii. We sailed to the Philippines. When we got to the Philippines, of course, we got liberty for a couple days while the Navy offloaded. They offloaded all the jets. We had 16 CH-53s, and they added some 46s, some Hueys, and Cobras from Okinawa just for support. And from there, once we set sail, nobody knew nothing until all of a sudden we got orders to Cambodia for Operation Eagle Pull,
Okay, and what was that?
the evacuation of Cambodia.
Okay. And who was being evacuated?
Americans, Canadians, Australians, and any Cambodians that were working with those forces.
Okay. Now, so basically, how did that process then work? What happened?
We basically, the helicopters launched, we flew in, had specific landing places, landed, picked up these people, and brought them out. And then the last ones, of course, once we're down to the finals, the last would have been the embassy staff and the Marine embassy guards.
Okay. Now, did you fly or did you stay on the ship?
I stayed on the ship. We had to keep them running.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, in that operation, did any of the helicopters get shot at or have battle damage? Or?
Actually, what was surprising was how concise that operation went. It was very smooth by military standards. We went in, we got the job done, and we pretty much left.
Okay. How long did that take?
Just the one day.
Okay. And did you see the people getting off? Or?
Not too much, because most of them were flown to like the command ship, the Blue Ridge, and other ships. None were brought to the carrier.
Okay.
That we were on anyway.
Okay. So the helicopters could go and they could drop people off on other ships and then come back
Oh, yeah.
to your ship for servicing, basically.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that's sort of the first adventure, and that's still in March, or we made it to April yet?
We're in April,
Okay.
April 12th.
All right. And in April now, the North Vietnamese have begun their final offensive into South Vietnam. So after April 12th, now what do you do?
Well, the ship got orders for liberty. We pulled into Singapore. Supposedly, according to the ship's captain, when we pulled in, it was supposed to be 10 days of liberty.
Mm-hmm.
2.5 days later, things kind of went south in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
So they ordered the fleet up. So they had to recall people from Liberty and get this. In fact, they actually had those that got left behind, Navy and Marines and that, because they couldn't wait.
Mm-hmm.
They had to get going by orders of the fleet admiral. What they did is they flew aircraft in to recover them, bring them back out to the ships, because it was kind of unexpected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I can just continue the story now. So the ship heads back up to
Now we're
Vietnam.
heading up towards the coast. It's one of those situations, the rumors are flying like crazy. I mean, you're hearing all kinds of stories, and most of us are just kind of like, well, our gunny was pretty good about it, the NCOIC of the shop. He basically says, hey, you're going to hear rumors galore. Just do your job, and once we get official word, then we'll make sure it gets passed to everybody. And most of the guys just took it that way.
Well, what kind of rumors were going around?
It's hard to remember pretty much, but basically like, South Vietnam's been attacked, or, we're having to arm the birds because this is no longer an evacuation. We're going back in, or, there was all kinds of things.
Okay.
And then there was some people saying, we're not even going there. We're going somewhere else, or something like that. It's like, and I'm kind of like, I'll just wait till he tells me. Because like I said, and it wasn't just Marines and Navy. You had all kinds of stories. We're going back to the Philippines because you guys are getting off in the Philippines, and we're taking our jets back because we have to go. And, well, okay. I don't remember all the specifics anymore because that was quite a while ago.
Okay. And then how quickly does stuff start happening? Are you sending helicopters in right away, or do you wait a while?
No, the ambassador kept talking with the president, kept saying, not yet, things are, because he really didn't want to end it. He wanted to continue to support the South Vietnamese people. I'll give him that one. Finally, on the 30th of April, and we've been off the coast, President Ford made the command decision, launched the Marine helicopters.
Mm-hmm.
He did not have to have permission, because anybody who knows history knows the military was divided. the President of the United States controls the Marine Corps. Congress controls the Army and Navy now, plus the Air Force. And that was something started by our founding fathers because they saw where somebody had total control of the military, sooner or later it's a dictatorship. And they didn't want that. So he can send in the Marines immediately before convening with Congress, so at least get the ball rolling. So we got our orders at like 3 in the morning to get the aircraft ready for launch. And as soon as the sun come up, we started launching. By then, he had met with Congress, and now the Navy is also launching. And then you got the huge Air Force transports. We couldn't use them for very long, though, because shortly after we launched, our first wave actually did come under some fire because the North Vietnamese Army was already at the international airport. That's why in the movies and in the videos, you always see them landing in parking lots, on top of hotels, on top of the embassy, because we couldn't use the airport. We had to do what we could as fast as we could.
Okay.
So we always thank the president for not dilly-dallying.
Yeah. Okay. So is your duty essentially the same as it was for Cambodia? You're on the ship.
I'm actually on the flight deck. Me and one other avionicsman. We have what they call a cruise box full of parts and equipment. And as the planes come in, they would announce avionics needed on spot 7. We'd grab our tools, get over there, get it fixed so it could launch. There'd be hydraulicsmen, metalsmiths, everything.
Okay. And so now, did some of these helicopters come back with battle damage, or were they?
There were a few that did have some bullet holes in that. Not very many, but
Okay.
there was the occasional, I would say, pot shots from the North Vietnamese Army.
Okay. Now, did they follow the same procedure as Cambodia? They would offload elsewhere, or did they bring them
No,
to
they offloaded wherever they could because things really started happening so fast. In fact, we actually had Vietnamese pilots landing on our ship. They had never landed at sea before, so it got interesting. You know, they're coming in old 47s and old Hueys that were left behind for them when we pulled out in '73. And the only problem was we had no room for them. So after they would land, we would help them offload. We were pushing the planes out, those aircraft out to the water to make room for ours.
All right. And what impression did you have of the people who were being evacuated? Did you see them at all?
Saw a lot of them, and a lot of them, as soon as they'd see you, because of course they were thanking all the people for getting them out, because unlike Cambodia, where the average, of course we didn't know that at the time, but the average person wasn't as affected as they were in Vietnam. So a lot of these people, if they even associated with foreigners, they were possibly going to be executed. So they were happy. They were glad. They were sad because they're leaving, because that's their homes. But they were also looking at the other side of, they were looking at both sides of the coin, basically. They didn't want to leave home, but they knew if they stayed, who knows what might have happened to them.
Okay. And was this basically a one-day operation?
It was basically about a 24-hour operation, but it was kind of hectic because we were flying in, and in fact, the captain of our ship, I overheard this conversation. He was being asked, they would keep seeing helicopters load. They would, when they were land, they would restock. Well, they were also restocking with ammo because we carried it. We didn't know, but of course we were under orders not to fire. And there were some news media on board some of the ships, and they actually questioned the captain of the ship, and he told me, he says, hey, those helicopters are designed to carry 33 combat troops. We're averaging about 100 Vietnamese people. We're having to throw stuff over the side to make room for these people. We're going to get as many out as we can. And that's basically what was going on. Some of those aircraft we had over 100 Vietnamese men, women, and children on board. Because we were going to do our best to get as many that wanted out of there as that could happen.
Okay. And then once that 24 hours or sort of concludes. What happens next?
Okay, now it's in the middle of the night. We're starting to wrap things up. Come daylight, we're going to be heading out. That's the orders. Though we were having to wait because we still had one of the 46s in the air that was flying search and rescue missions, SAR, and they got a radio call from the embassy. The Marines were still there, so we had to do a hurry-up launch to go get them. They were still doing the normal stuff of destroying documents and all that, and they kind of got missed.
Okay.
But we did get in, we did get them, bring them back out.
So there is one last bunch there longer than they're supposed to be. But the North Vietnamese didn't come in and...
They were actually at the doors to the embassy when we landed. I don't think they knew anybody was in there, and if they did, they hadn't actually come in yet. But of course, they were going to go through and tear it up, and that was their whole plan.
Right.
I don't know if they knew the Marines were still there or not, but we didn't wait. We got them out.
Okay. Okay. Where do you go then from there?
From there, our ship first had orders. The captain of the ship first got orders because of Mayaguez. But the captain had to contact the fleet admiral and says, what do I do with the almost 3,000 Vietnamese refugees I've got on board? So they had to reassign that mission. So then we headed for the Philippines. Once in the Philippines, we offloaded all the refugees.
Okay. And now, do you stay with the fleet or do you go back to Hawaii?
Now what they're going to do is they decided they're going to send us back to Hawaii, so they offloaded our aircraft off of the Hancock, and they put us on board the USS Enterprise to go home, because she was on her way back to San Diego. The Hancock would be staying out there as part of the Pacific deployment.
Right.
So we get to ride the Enterprise back home.
Okay. And what vintage was this version of the Enterprise?
This was the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. She was made in 1959, but she was still the queen of the fleet, believe me.
Now, does that mean you have better quality accommodations or anything else?
Oh, yes. A lot better. And it's nothing against the Hancock. She was just older. She served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. CVA 19, and you figure we're up to like 79 now. So she was kind of old.
Okay. And then you go back to Hawaii, and as you just go back to your base and back to your regular squadron and duties.
Yeah, in fact, we did a fly-off from the Enterprise because she wasn't stopping in Hawaii. She wasn't going to be stopping at Pearl. She was going straight home. They had been out at sea for almost a year, and these guys wanted to get home. So we did a fly-off, and when we landed, the base has a grade school. So as we landed and they put us in formation, the students from the grade school were there, and they come out and each one put a lei around the traditional Hawaiian greeting, each one of us that came back. So that was kind of nice. And then they had customs set up right there in the hangar, and then it was liberty.
Okay. Now, how long did you wind up then staying in Hawaii?
I was there from December of '74 through December of '77.
Okay. And did your girlfriend ever get to come out and visit?
Yes, she finally come out in June of '75, and at 10:30 in the morning on the 27th of June, on top of Nu'uana Poly Lookout, I asked her to marry me.
I guess that worked.
Well, she's put up with me for 43, almost 43 years now.
Okay. Now, then did she stay out there with you? Or
No, she didn't stay out. She went back home because, of course, break the news to the families and get things ready. And I actually took leave in September of '75, went back, and we got married there, so the families.
Okay. And then you just had a little more time left in Hawaii. Did she come back out at
Yes,
that
she
point?
came back out, and then once I was promoted to corporal, I was able to apply for a company tour, having my family with me. And that added the year. I would have left the island in '76, but that added one more year because I had my family with me, so I stayed an extra year.
Okay. Now, do you stay with the same unit, or do you?
Pretty much. Now, I did go on a temporary duty to Okinawa from July of 77 to November of 77. There was a bunch of us, they were short of personnel, and one of the squadrons was being retired. So they kind of just pulled people. There was some of us came from Hawaii, some came from Tustin, Marine Corps Base there, go over and help them get those aircraft ready to retire. And during that time, we also had joint war games with the Philippine Defense Force that we were down in the Philippines doing, playing war games.
Okay. And what kind of impression did you have of Okinawa?
I actually liked it there. The first time I was there, it was, of course, aside from the Philippines, I'd never been anywhere but Canada my entire life. Growing up in Detroit, Canada was like a suburb. Because it was actually easier to get to Canada than it was to get to some of the suburbs. So, to me, I tried to, just like in Hawaii, I'd go traveling around the island, go visiting. Okinawa, same thing. We were at Futenma down in the southern part of the island. The whole island's only like 66 miles long. And you didn't need to have a car or nothing. So I'd walk all over the place just to see it.
And how did people there seem to view you or treat the Americans?
When you got away from the actual base, because you always got, I don't care what military base you go to, where or what country's military it is, around the base it can be hit or miss. But you get out in the public, it's a little different. It's just like anywhere else. And I was surprised at how many could speak English better than a lot of Americans can. But I learned that Japanese, that's required, not only their own language. Well, Okinawa actually was an independent nation at one time. But they do the same thing. They teach their people English because it is a more general language. So a lot of them could speak it better than a lot of people I know today. And they were nice. And then later on, because I visited Okinawa 3 more times in my career. So I was there 4 times total. I later on learned, I had said earlier, my father had passed away when I was young. I knew he was a Marine, but I didn't know what he did. Well, I found out he fought on Guadalcanal and Okinawa.
Okay.
So that even made Okinawa a little, and I took the battlefield tour when I was there, one of the times.
Okay. All right. Is there still stuff left in terms of defensive works or caves or things like that?
Yeah, a lot of the underground compounds are still there. What they do is they're caged off so you can see them, and you can still see the bullet holes in the walls. And then they would have maps in back, some of the original Japanese military maps and stuff that you could view. They had other areas, and at the final part of it's called the Peace Park, where they cover some of the things that went on, how the Okinawans were treated by the Japanese, how they were treated afterwards, and stuff like that.
Okay. All right. And so you also were involved in joint exercises with the Filipinos. Did you work with any of them directly, or were you just doing
We
your own
did a
stuff?
little bit. There was always Philippine military, most time not on the bases, but they were nearby. I met a few of them, not a lot, because we were taking care of the helicopters. We didn't see as many. They would be out in the field more. But we would deal with a few of them now and then.
Okay. Now, the different units you served with, did you ever train Filipino personnel or have any of them in some of the training units? Or? No. Okay. All right. So have you basically decided at this point that you're going to stay in the Marines? Or?
At that point, I did not, because I was over in Okinawa. I was actually thinking about getting out. But I got back in November. And of course, in December, I'm going to be transferring. And I still had 2 years left on my contract because I had enlisted for 6. And we were talking about it because it's been 4 years. And I talked with the wife. And at that point, back home, Detroit, of course, with the oil embargo, There was a lot of layoffs. Even my dad called and says, even where he was working, he worked for Guardian Glass. He said, there's not a lot of work back here. So I talked with her. Our son was born in '76 there in Hawaii. At that point, I decided to re-enlist, and I re-enlisted before I left for another 4 years. And then after that, yeah, it was pretty much obvious what was going to happen.
All right. So after Hawaii, now what's your next assignment?
Actually, I got orders back to Marine Corps Air Station New River and back to HMT 204, right back to where I started, which I thought was kind of funny. Now, I did spend quite a bit of time in North Carolina, but I was with different units.
Okay.
I was with 204 for a short period of time. Then I joined HMM 261, which is Medium Marine Helicopter Squadron. And what happens is those squadrons are part of the float system for the deployments. It's a squadron, they'll have 12 46s, and then we supply 453s, and they supply Cobras and Hueys. And then you spend 6 months out at sea on a float, med float. Now, the one thing that happened while I was in Hawaii, to regress a little bit, the Marine Corps went to specific MOSs. So whatever squadron you were in at the time, that's your MOS now. So my MOS became 6323, which was ComNav technician on the 53s.
Okay.
So that's what I'm going to be working on the rest of my career.
All right. So you no longer get to be the jack of all trades
Right.
and work on all the different aircraft.
The electronics are advancing to the point where it would actually cost the military, not just the Marine Corps, but even the Navy, and the electronics are advancing so much that what would happen is it would cost more to keep retraining than to just put them in a specific aircraft.
Okay. So now you've got that. And now, did you go on these cruises then?
I went on med cruise. We left in September of 1979 and came back in February of 1980.
Okay. What was that cruise like?
Basically, you cruise the Mediterranean with the Atlantic Fleet. They have a carrier attack group and what they call a helicopter assault group. You spend 6 months. You do, like when we first got out there, we did a joint operation with the Greek and Turkish armies called, it's called Display Determination. It was, of course, the Cold War is going on back then. The Russian Southern Fleet is down there, so you're kind of showing the Russians that, hey, we're still here. We're still keeping an eye on you, type thing.
Right.
And then you spend the rest of the 6 months floating around the Mediterranean. Like we pulled Liberty in Greece. When you go into Naples, one time it was a Liberty port, another time it's a working port. We spend a couple weeks there, but that allows you to get the aircraft worked on. We did some war games in Sigonella. We spent some time out in the field in Sardinia. We also saw Spain, got to spend Christmas in Palma de Mallorca, which is basically Spain's version of Hawaii.
Yeah. Okay. And when you go ashore, what kind of treatment or reception do you find in these places?
Pretty good. One night in Palma, after I had shore patrol one day, and then we were out one evening. We were sitting there drinking, and some gentlemen joined us, and we're drinking, and it turned out they were from the Russian army that was on Liberty there. And I made the mistake of trying to do my turn to buy. No. Basically grabbed my arm and says, no. We buy for Marines. Most of the people in every country I've been, if you get out and treat them like you would normal people, don't play the tourist or the typical party hardy military, they're fine.
Okay. You did shore patrol. What does that duty consist of?
Basically, you're on duty, usually it's for one 24-hour period, and you're basically kind of patrolling out there. A, you're trying to keep the guys from getting in trouble. B, you're just kind of watching them also. I mean, you got both sides of the coin. You got the people that'll try to take advantage of a military. You got the military that'll try to take advantage of a situation. And you just want to try and keep it calm. You're not trying to get anybody in trouble. You're just, like a lot of the bars and nightclubs throughout, they'll invite you in and buy you something to eat. Because when you're in there, everybody behaves, not just the military.
Yeah.
And then when you go on to the next one, and they'll do the same thing. And it's not as bad as, of course, the movies always play it up a little more. And yes, we do have incidents, but that's what we're there for, to try and keep it calm.
Right. Okay. A little bit broader question at this point. So you've been in now for a fair number of years, and you come in the mid 70s. Now you're getting through the late 70s. Were there problems that you ever noticed with things like drug use or alcoholism or that kind of thing?
I don't know if it wasn't I didn't pay so close attention. I mean, yeah, we all partied hard, but it seemed like we worked just as hard. There could have been, but I'll be honest, I probably didn't pay as much attention, or maybe instead of making a public issue out of it, they just handled it. I'm sure it was there.
But it wasn't something that ever kind of
No,
caught your attention.
No.
Yeah. And how would you characterize morale in the units you were with?
For the most part, the morale was pretty good. We did have one incident on our med cruise where a guy had a rough time. Because as well as we were being treated by the locals, Americans was another story back then. And this gentleman, he was from a small town in New England, and he ran into people he'd gone to school with their kids, and they treated him like dirt. He was an American Marine. He was treated better, but we were treated better by the Russians there in Palma than he was treated by people from his hometown. And it was hard on him for a while, because he was younger than I was. I was 20 when I went into service, and it hit him hard. But for the most part, we'd do our job. We'd go out on liberty, come back and do our job.
All right. And how much contact do you have with home while you're out with the
Back then,
cruise?
of course, you didn't have the internet like you do, so it was mail. Now, my wife come up with a smart idea, because the mail system, once you get out in that fleet, turtles go faster. So she started numbering the letters. And then I started numbering them back. That way, when letter 4 got there before letter 2, you'd hear guys open a letter. What do you mean you solved this problem? What problem? Well, here, she would put it in sequence so you could, so I would just put letter 4 away until letter 2 showed up. Or if I read letter 4, I'd say, well, I'll wait and find out what went on when letter 2 gets there. So she was pretty good about that. And then every once in a while, when it was available, they would set up the radio on the ship where they could call to a ham operator in the States, and then all you'd have to pay for it is the call from that ham operator's house to your house, and you could talk on the radio. Of course, it was limited, and you had to do the over and out and all that, but that was kind of a joy thing to do every once in a while.
Okay. All right. Now, did you have just the one med cruise, or?
One med cruise.
And did you have cruises in the Caribbean or Atlantic otherwise?
Well, the Caribbean was the evacuation of Cuba, 1980. Okay. We had got back in February, and next thing you know, the squadron hadn't broken up yet. It was still composite. They put us on board the USS Saipan, one of the new LHAs, and sent us down for the evacuation of Cuba. So I guess you could call that a Caribbean cruise.
Okay. Now, why was there an evacuation of Cuba?
Basically, a lot of the Cubans had finally pretty much had it, and they were leaving. And problems were, that's hurricane season, and these people were just leaving. So on rowboats, on rafts, and then of course you had, and I'm not going to say it's any particular nationality, but you had the bloodsuckers. They were taking their yachts down and charging thousands of dollars to get people out. And we helped the Coast Guard with that too a little bit, confiscating, basically it's called piracy.
All right. So you're calling it an evacuation, but it's not like Cambodia or Vietnam where you're flying into the country to pick up, because the only American presence really in Cuba at that point is at Guantanamo, and we didn't evacuate Guantanamo.
No.
But this is the era of the Cuban boat people large numbers of them all leaving and
Correct.
taking to sea. And so you're picking people up out of the
Yes.
water?
And in some cases, the boat was swamped. They're all floating in the water. These are shark-infested waters. We're getting them out as fast as we can.
Okay.
It was an interesting time.
Would you bring them onto the ship, or would they?
They would bring them onto the ship, and then because it wasn't that far, we would fly them over to the aircraft carriers because they had planes. They could actually take them into Miami and into the airport. So they didn't stay with us. That allowed us to continue down there a lot longer than we probably would have been able to.
So how long did you stay doing that?
We were only down there about a month.
Okay. All right. Okay. And then did you go to sea for other things, or just otherwise stay on the base?
Well, pretty much stayed on the base after that. Now that's 1980. So 81, 82, I'm pretty much on the base. Well, I'm working on the base. We actually lived out in town. I joined the volunteer fire department in my area. The one thing about North Carolina, there's a lot of volunteer fire departments. Just in the county where we lived, Onslow County, you had 23 fire departments and only 2 of them were paid. That was the base in the city of Jacksonville. The rest was all volunteers, and you'd meet all kinds of people. There were military. One of the guys on one of our sister fire departments was the weather reporter for Channel 12 News. I mean, everybody helped out because you took care of each other.
Okay.
And I pretty much stayed there. Now, I'd left 261 in 80, but instead of going back to HMT 204, I got reassigned to HMH 362.
All right. And is that again the medium helicopter?
No, this is actually a full heavy helicopter
Helicopter.
squadron.
Okay.
And then towards the end of the year, they came out with a program. The Marine Corps was getting the new CH-53 Echoes, and they were looking for people to go for schooling on it. And I submitted my name. And when I went for the interview with the maintenance chief, he told me, you probably won't get this because you've only got 1 med cruise. He said, but what happened was, it just so happened I was the only ComNav tech that applied. The rest were electricians.
Okay.
So I got to school. So I got to go to the Sikorsky factory in Connecticut for schooling on this new helicopter the Marine Corps was getting.
Okay. And what really made this one any different from the earlier ones?
The A's and deltas that the Marine Corps had, you had 6 main rotor blades, and if you went from tip to tip, you're talking about 76 feet. It could carry about 33 combat troops, and then if in combat, a lot of times you had a crew of 5. You had the pilot, co-pilot, you had the crew chief, who was also the door gunner, you had the first mech, who was also the window gunner on the other side. But one thing we learned from the guys in Vietnam is a lot of times when the helicopters would land and the ramps would open to let the Marines out, the enemy would fire in. So they put tripod mounts to put M60s, so when the ramp lowered, we could shoot out, and hopefully nobody shot back. We didn't want to know. We just, so you could have that extra person. Well, with the new helicopter, the Echo, the first thing was it had in-flight refueling capabilities. And instead of 6 main rotor blades, it had 7. And tip to tip was about 79 feet.
Okay.
Instead of 2 engines, it had 3. It could carry 55 combat troops, or it could basically lift its own weight, 30,000 pounds, external load. So you're getting this heavier duty. And the basic reason that the Navy and Marine Corps wanted it is it could lift everything in the Navy and Marine Corps inventory, ground or air. So if a jet went down, we could go get it and get it back, not have to leave it behind.
Okay. All right. So how long did you spend in Connecticut?
Well, it was 2 separate classes. The first time was about 2.5 to 3 months. Then we reported back to our squadrons. And then we went back up to help finish up, because the second time we went, we were only there a couple of months. But that was to get things wrapped up because the planes were going to start joining the fleet and form the first squadron, which was HMH 464.
Okay. And did you join that squadron?
Yes. And then we got the first of the airframes.
All right. Okay. Now, where was that squadron going to be based?
It was based at MAG 29 Marine Corps Air Station, New River.
Okay, so you're still basically at home.
Just now I'm on the other side of the base.
Okay.
From one side of the base to the other, basically.
Now, did that squadron go on a cruise or just stay where they were while you were there?
Pretty much it wouldn't go anywhere. It didn't have full complement of aircraft. And part of it was a bunch of us ended up on what's called the FOT&E, Fleet Operational Test and Evaluation. We were sent on what they call temporary additional duty orders to Quantico, Virginia, home of Marine Helicopter Squadron 1.
Okay.
On the green side, the white side would be the president's side. What we're going to do is run this new helicopter through its paces. So we did some flight training there in the Quantico area. And one of the things we had to do was take it up the Pax River to the Navy Test Center, fly it there so they could run some tests on it, including this guy who zaps lightning into the planes. It's an actual electronic machine that was created, and they wouldn't actually put the aircraft in the air, but they would do all the simulations. They would put it up on jacks and raise the landing gear so it would simulate that the plane was flying, hit this electricity with it, because that's something that aircraft have to deal with in flying is lightning strikes.
Right.
And then they would study the effect it had on the rotor blades, on the electronic equipment, on the fuel system, so they could come up with ways to protect it. And then from there, we flew it out to the West Coast, did some mountain training with it. And then one of the things they did was they flew it from Tustin, California to New River, North Carolina, nonstop. First ever helicopter nonstop cross-country flight. But this was all testing these systems out.
Right, and of course this is one you can refuel in the air, so
Correct.
you get
So
to
it just kept
stay
right on going.
Okay. Now, how common was it for you to fly in these helicopters?
Once I had gotten trained enough, I ended up on avionics test skins. When planes would get fixed, sometimes they would require test flight. So then you'd have an avionics man, a hydraulics man, a metalsmith would all fly on it just to watch those systems that were fixed, make sure everything's working. So I got to fly quite a lot. And any chance I could, I'd fly on them.
All right. Okay. So now how long then do you stay with that new unit?
I stayed with 464 for a short period of time. Then I was transferred to the HAMS 26. That was the basically the command next step up from a squadron you're going into. And what I was doing is I was sent there as part of the group quality assurance, where we kind of overseen all the maintenance on all the squadrons. Plus we would get tech crews in, like they were designing some new systems for the aircraft, and it was civilian crews, and it was our job to oversee what they were doing, make sure they didn't mess anything up, or if they had problems that we were kind of the go-betweens. And then we would look over the aircraft, make sure everything's ready to go before it got returned to the unit.
Okay. Now, have you been moving up in rank at all during this time, or
Little by little, I'm now a sergeant. In fact, while I was with HAMS, I got orders back to Hawaii. Now, of course, while we were in North Carolina, our daughter was born there at Camp Lejeune. So I got orders back to Hawaii and back to 463.
Okay.
And the one thing I liked about it, aside from the military things, I liked Hawaii. Even when you're broke, you could always go to the beach and go swimming. I mean, there's always something to do. But my son was now old enough to see where he was born.
Okay.
That was kind of nice. And then the one thing we always did is when we got orders like that, especially when the kids were gone, I didn't take the rush out there. I took the maximum time they would allow. And we would tour the country. Kids would see things that they would talk about in school later on, you know, and visit relatives and stuff like that. So we wouldn't rush it. We would make a vacation out of it, but they'd learn too. You know, Mount Rushmore, Yellowstone, all these places that they probably wouldn't have seen otherwise.
Sure. Okay. So when do you get to Hawaii this time?
Let's see. It was 83. Thinking right around September, October of 83.
Okay. And how long will that tour last?
3 years, because I had my family with me.
Okay.
It'd be 2 years if you're unaccompanied. I know they've changed it since then. I don't know what it is now.
Okay. And now, was this a fairly quiet period, or
For the most part, yes. In fact, at that point, I had only spent a little bit of time in my MOS in avionics when I got reassigned to maintenance control. Maintenance control, just like QA and stuff like that, they would take different people from different shops. And what you would do in maintenance control, that's just what it sounds like. You're controlling the maintenance of the aircraft. You're getting the information from the operations department. We need the helicopters configured for this, for these operations. And you're going with the shops to make sure they're configured for whatever training. You're making sure what they call downing discrepancies are taken care of and things like that, keep the planes operational and safe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you go out with the fleet at all, or are you just entirely on the base?
Pretty much on the base. At one point, I was transferred to the medium helicopter squadron for a 6-month det to Okinawa, which was common, and they would rotate people, and mine was in 80. My trip to Okinawa was in 85. Of course, I stayed in maintenance control because once you're in, they'd kind of like to keep you. Well, part of it is you have the authority to sign a plane safe for flight. So basically, you're taking all that information from all the work centers, the operations, and you're saying that you've compiled it all, you've compared it, you've talked with QA, the plane is safe to fly. You're signing that piece of paper, then that pilot and crew is going out there and flying it.
Okay.
So you kind of, once you get in there, they kind of keep you there because they put some training into it.
All right. Okay. Anything else that kind of stands out about that tour in Hawaii in that period?
Well, when I went to Okinawa, we also ended up aboard ship down to the Philippines again. But that was just, and then having to spend a couple days just floating in the ocean because we were caught between 2 hurricanes.
Okay.
So we couldn't go anywhere. And then going back to Okinawa. Also went up to Yokosuka Air
Japan,
Base.
yeah.
Yes. Actually, we went to the Navy base, spent some time there. But the bad luck was when we got there, the USS Midway had pulled in and had used up the Navy barracks. So us with our 453s, we were forced to stay in a hotel in town.
Gee, sorry about that.
Yeah. That was kind of nice because you get to meet the people. Though they did have a problem with the hotel design, and I always talk about this. Back then, you didn't have the key card, so you had to go get your key from the desk. And then to get to the elevators, to get to your room, you had to go through the bar.
Okay.
Well,
Be a slow trip.
Yeah. So that was interesting. And then one of our officers found out we were going to be up there, so he managed to purchase a whole bunch of tickets to Tokyo Disneyland. So a bunch of us went to Disneyland in Tokyo, which was very interesting.
So what did they have at Tokyo Disneyland? Does it look like a regular Disneyland?
Yeah. It wasn't quite as big because this was only its 3rd year in existence. It had only been there 3 years. It was still growing, but it was kind of neat. I'd taken the kids to Disneyland when we transferred, and a lot of it was the same. The only thing you had to kind of get used to is on the cars, the narrations were in Japanese, but all the characters, like in the Haunted Mansion, are speaking English. It could get a little confusing at times. But if you paid close attention, you could figure out what was going on.
All right.
But other than that, it was enjoyable.
Okay. All right. And so then when does that Hawaii tour end up?
That ended about September of 86.
86? Okay.
And I got orders back to New River. Now, of course, here's on the other side of the coin. Now my daughter's old enough to see where she was born.
Okay.
Of course, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but both my kids are military brats. And in case anybody's curious, means born, raised, and transferred into service.
Right.
So we're back there. Now this time, I get there in towards the end of 86, but it was only a 3-year tour this time. I joined 360. Yeah, 362 I went back to. And we lived in a different part of town, and I joined another volunteer fire unit. And then in 90, it was kind of uneventful. Went on a few little debts, no more. I did in 88. Once we got back there, I did go on a North Atlantic cruise.
Okay.
Called Teamwork 88. Up around Norway. And then for Liberty, we got to go to Ireland for 4 days. So that was nice. But that was a short thing. That was just basically war games with the Norwegian, Swedish, Royal Marines, British Navy up in the North Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Now you get down toward 1990. Now you're getting to the point where Saddam Hussein decides that Kuwait should be the 21st province of Iraq, and things get interesting again.
Well, I was in North Carolina at the time, and I got orders to California this time, to Tustin Marine Corps Air Station helicopters. Now, this was in February of 90, and the kids were in school, so me and the wife talked about it and decided now I'm already to the point where I'm on my last hitch, basically. Mm-hmm. But one thing we learned in the military, and it don't matter what service, if you turn down orders, that's an excuse for them to send you packing.
Right.
So I got orders. With the kids in school, we decided we're not going to pull the kids out of school because they would miss so much school it would hurt them. Mm-hmm. So her and the kids stayed in North Carolina, and I headed out to California. Along the way, I kidnapped my wife's grandmother. Well, I was traveling ahead and found out that my wife's cousin lived in California, and their grandmother was going to go out in a couple weeks to see them. Well, her cousin's husband was going to leave on a Friday afternoon, drive all the way to Nashville, Tennessee, mm-hmm. get a couple hours sleep, and then drive back so he could be back to work on Monday. And we're like, well, I'm going anyway. So we called him up to see if she could come out a couple weeks early, and she rode with me.
Okay. So
I get out to there, and I check in HMH 466, part of that squadron. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the first things that happened is just becoming part of it. I actually ended up in maintenance control again. Like I said, once you're in, you're pretty much stuck. It's gonna happen. You learn to accept it. And then after the kids were out of school in July, I went back and got the family, took some leave, went back and got the family. Mm-hmm. Actually, that would have been June, because in July, our unit got orders up to mountain warfare training. So we took a couple helicopters up there to play in the mountains on the north side of Yosemite. Mm-hmm. So now I'm seeing someplace else I'd never seen before. Okay. And that's one of the things I'll be the first to admit. All the places I went, it was enjoyable, mm-hmm. except one, and we'll get to that one later. Mm-hmm. The place was kind of enjoyable, but the whole reason we were there made it not so great. And then the other thing I recommend to people, when you are places, enjoy the local food. See, that's like regressing back a little bit to North Carolina. The first time I was there, we lived out in town. My next door neighbor was a Jacksonville City police officer. And within a couple months, I knew more about the area than he did. I'd been to the Battleship North Carolina. I'd been to the Tyrone Palace, which was the original government seat of the state of North Carolina. I got out and visited and did things. I didn't just hang around the base or hang around the house. Right. We would take the kids. We would go places. And I think that's one of the big things. I think where a lot of guys get turned off on the military, or women, both. I don't want to pick on one or the other. All they do is hang around the base, and then after a while they get so frustrated mm-hmm. when there's so much to see out there.
All right. So you're going to go back in here to your story. So you're going to do mountain training, and then what comes next?
Well, we're up in the mountain training. We got orders back to the base. Units pulling out. We're being deployed. This was a little different than going on a ship. We were taking 8 aircraft, and we were going to break them down. We're going to break them down so they could be loaded into C-5As. Mm-hmm. Once broken down, you can fit 2, and then you put crew on top. We had our orders. We were going to Saudi Arabia. Now, My NCOIC, considering I just got my family out there, put me on the last flight leaving. He said, I'll give you a little more time to spend with your family since you just got them. So I was on the last plane that left. We broke down our helicopter. It takes about 12 to 13 hours to get them complete broke down. You got to remove all the rotor blades. You got to remove one tail blade, the upper anti-collision light. You got to fold the tail. You got to remove the gearbox. You got to deflate the struts. You got to take the helicopter tires off and put jet tires on. You got to remove the fuel probe and all the electronic equipment too. And then they can actually be pushed into the C5As.
How long does it take to break one down?
About 12 hours,
Okay.
constant work. And it takes about 14 hours. It takes about 12 hours to put them together, and then you got to do a test flight, about 2-hour test flight once you put them back together.
Okay. Now, if you're flying in a C5A, it's a big transport plane.
Right.
What kind of accommodations does that have for passengers?
It has a whole upper area that's seats like an airline.
Okay. So it's not like being in a C-130 or
No.
something like that? Or,
No.
Yeah.
I've flown in some of them too.
Okay. And so again, it's just like 12, 13 hours or whatever, the long flight out to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, we flew from Tustin, California. Being how we were the last ones, we had to go straight through where the others got to stop at the Air Force Base outside of Philly. We flew straight through to Germany. And then once the embassies got clearance for us to fly over Egyptian airspace, then we went down and then landed at Jubail International Airport, where our aircraft were offloaded and we started putting them back together.
All right. So when did you actually get to Saudi Arabia?
Let's see. It would have been August of 1990.
Okay. All right. And now once you're there, what happens?
Well, first off, we're in Jubail, which is the international airport, brand new. It hadn't even opened yet. Now the U.S. military is using it. And met some very interesting Saudi personnel. Some of the Saudi Navy was there. So they were really helpful in helping us get kind of acclimated to the area. And then we start putting our aircraft together and getting them tested. And apparently, Saudis are some very nice people. We'd been there about a week, and one of the things we used to do is take tarps to cover the windscreens on the helicopters, because that's not glass, it's a plexiglass composite material. And in that hot sun, they would warp.
Okay.
So you cover them to protect them. Well, the Saudi crew that was sharing the area we were at inside the terminal asked us where he could get some of those, so we gave him the information. And a couple nights later, we were invited over to one of their hangars. They had all these tarps spread out, and they brought in dinner. They treated us dinner, and then they had a whole refrigerated semi full of Coke brought in, because they were thankful. As far as they were concerned, us arriving so quick kept Saddam from invading.
Right.
Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I wasn't going to turn down the food. It was delicious.
Okay. All right. Now, the official Gulf War per se doesn't start until early '91. So you've got a period of months there. There's a buildup of Allied forces going on.
And then our unit, once our aircraft were fully tested and built up, we were moved to Ras Al Ghar. We were moved closer to the front so we could support the ground troops.
Okay.
And anything else, heavy equipment, stuff like that.
Okay. Aside from the heat, what other kinds of problems were there with trying to run a helicopter unit?
The sand. Think of a sandblaster. You got this rotor head turning 20,000 RPM. So rotor blades were an issue, because when they're turning like that, especially in the sand, it starts eating away at the paint and the material. So we learned from the Israeli Air Force on tips to help with that problem. But I would say the biggest issue was the sand.
Okay. And would that mess up just other parts of the aircraft as
it
well
would.
and get into everything?
It'd get into everything. And yes, it would be hard on the electronics. It would be hard on the airframe. It would be hard on just about every part of that aircraft.
Okay. Now, while you're there with this period of several months, I mean, are you following news and trying to keep up on what's happening, or do you just do your job but ignore everything else?
We would hear occasion, because once we got to Ras Al Ghar, there wasn't a whole lot of direct communication, because it was one of those things. In fact, we had a bunch of us had a T-shirt made, and it showed the map of Saudi Arabia on it, and it said somewhere, somewhere else, you know, because you're not allowed to say where you're at. And we kind of made a joke about it, but it was limited what we would get just because of that reason. Their thing was is if we had too much direct access, the enemy could figure out where we were, and you really don't want them to know.
Okay.
And that was the primary thing. And for the most part, you know, we're helping get the troops placed where they need to be placed. We're doing our jobs, and basically that was the primary.
Okay. So you're moving Marine personnel and supplies different places.
Right. The artillery, stuff like that. And then we continue our training too, because you never want to stop. The more you train, the better, the more, so you keep flying anyway. Keep the aircraft available, because you never know what's going to happen. We didn't know, today it's nice, peaceful, tomorrow we might get the word. So we're going to be ready.
Okay. Now, aside from meeting some of the Saudis, do you see any of the other coalition people there? Or?
We saw some Australians. Of course, we saw Israelis. They helped. They were real helpful with a lot of that stuff, because they deal with the sand all the time, and they use a lot of U.S. aircraft.
Were there Israelis in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
You don't hear about that too often.
Not in a sense that they were part of the coalition, but they were, because they were allies.
Right.
They were there to help us get through that stuff, because they had their side of the fence to really watch.
Okay, because I guess that's the period when Saddam is shooting Scud missiles at Israel as well as at Saudi Arabia.
He's just shooting them everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't too particular. Of course, the Scud missile was not one of your most accurate. Once you launched it, you could aim it at, let's say, Riyadh, and it might hit 60 miles the other way. It was not a very accurate missile, so once they launched, everybody's put on alert, because you don't know where it might land.
Now, did any of them land in any of the areas where you were?
We had a couple of close calls. The Patriot missiles took care of that. We got put on alert, woke up at dark 30 in the morning to go get in our bunkers, because there was one head, and then Patriot missiles took care of them.
Okay.
None that actually hit,
Right.
but there were a few times.
Okay. Now, how much sort of outside news are you getting while you're there? Communications any better than they were back in the Vietnam era? Or?
Oh yeah, they're a lot better, because a lot more computerized. And the squadron was also trying to help. Like, what they would do is they would get the wives and families over to the squadron, the hangar, and they would do a videotape. So you could say hi to everybody, and then they would send that to us. And then they would, at times, of course, we couldn't all do, like the family didn't meet all at one time. We'd have to do it a little bit at a time, because you still got jobs to do. And then we would get to return, and then they would send it back. Mail was a little bit better. I won't say a lot, because the mail system but it was a little bit better. And of course, you're in an area where you can get more news. We weren't too far from Aramco, the international oil company that serviced the oil rigs for the Saudis. So you have those people, they would come and visit, and they would pass things on. And there was a little, you know, of course, you're talking the 90s, now you got satellites are more prevalent, so. But you didn't have like TVs in every tent or nothing like that, but it was a little more accessible.
Right. So you're not watching CNN or that kind of thing?
No, he did, Saddam. That's one of the reasons they didn't want us broadcasting where we were or getting, because he's paying attention on those.
Yeah, okay. Now, as we get closer to the operation starting, how much advance warning did you have that it was on?
Well, we kind of got a sneak peek. Our supply chief, maintenance material control chief, had gone up to Jubail, where our group headquarters was, to pick up some supplies, and he heard something was in the wind. He didn't hear any details, but he did pick up, so when he got back, so we started prepping we got everybody up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, set up crews, and we were going to make sure we were ready. And if it didn't happen, well, that's all right. But it did happen. We got orders to launch.
Okay, so now what happens?
Well, we got our 8 aircraft ready to go, and we launched them. Our sister squadron launched theirs, and at that point, all we can do is sit and wait. And wait till they come back.
So how long would they be out?
Well, that first day, they were gone most of the day. And then if you've ever seen war movies where you see the guys sitting there counting the planes when they would come back, well, that's what we did when they started coming back. We're sitting there counting them as they fly by. Make sure we had 8 come back.
Right.
We sent 8 out, we want 8 coming back. And we were lucky. For the most, we didn't lose any aircraft at any given time.
Okay. And did you learn anything about what they actually had done while they were out?
Yeah, we would hear about it because, of course, they would have to go debrief and all that. And, of course, you would hear about it sooner or later. There would be different things going on. Part of it, which I won't go into any details, I don't know what's considered anything, but part of it we'd be relocating the troops. Okay, the troops are at this point, now they're over here, or the artillery was here, now we're moving it over here. You know, strategic placements.
But they're not involved in any kind of combat assault sort of thing, or?
In a way, because we would fly the troops to the combat zone,
Right.
and then they would offload to go to that extent, or we would take the artillery crew and their gun to a spot where they're going to start firing. So our helicopters with their 50 cals are their initial defense when we first land. And hopefully, and one of the reasons you don't want to keep the helicopters, because that, as big as it is, it'd give away a position sooner or later. So you get them in and then get out.
Right.
So they could do their job faster.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of weapons have long enough range that bad guys some distance away with machine guns or whatever could still target you, or missiles or whatever they've got. Yeah. Okay. So, okay. Now how long does this sort of go on? I mean, is it just because the war per se, the shooting war officially, is only a few days?
Well, for the troops and that, ours went on quite longer because you had to move. They had to move into Kuwait, so we had to keep them supplied.
Right.
And then, if any were, they had the helicopters to bring those that were injured or wounded or whatever out. Plus, you bring in fresh supplies, fresh troops. Our helicopter squadron was one of the first 53 squadrons there, and most of the 53s of all the squadrons that were there were some of the last to leave because of the versatility.
Right. Because you're moving personnel and supplies
We can
around.
move personnel, we can move the cargo, we can recover a Humvee that's broke down or been shot up, we can recover a downed jet. It's so versatile, there's more that it can do. So when you start sending the smaller helicopters back, you keep the bigger one because he can do their job plus his.
Now, did you go into Kuwait at all yourself?
No, I did not.
Okay. All right. So how long does the squadron then stay in Saudi Arabia?
We left in March of '91.
Okay. So a couple of months sort of after the action. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And from there, is it back to California again?
Back to California to rebuild the aircraft. Then back, and all this time I'm still in maintenance control. And sitting there and end up back in mountain warfare training with a couple of aircraft for another stint. And then it was one more trip to Okinawa. And that's when I took the battlefield tour because I found out my dad had fought there. It was a way to kind of connect since I was so young when he passed.
Okay. Yeah. And now with Okinawa, does your family stay back in California?
Yes. Yeah, because it's basically a 6-month net. The aircraft stay there, but they rotate to personnel.
Right.
The basic policy was you go out for 6 months, you're back for 12 to 18, then you go out for another 6.
Now you're getting toward the end of your enlistment, though.
Yes.
So this trip is sort of your last. Is that your last one?
In fact, when I went to Okinawa, it wasn't my last trip.
Okay.
When I went to Okinawa, while we were there, the Stars and Stripes, which is the military paper for the bases in the Far East, had an article about General Schwarzkopf announcing his retirement. Week later, the next paper comes out, and here's General Colin Powell announcing his retirement. I'm like, what do they know that I don't? That was my thought. I don't know if it meant anything, but so I went up and put in my retirement package, because once you reach 13 months, you can put in. And then I kind of thought, yeah, I think it's time to retire, because the S1 clerk was actually born 2 weeks after I went to boot camp. So now I'm thinking, yeah, maybe it is time to, this kid wasn't even around when I started.
Right.
But it wasn't quite to be. I'd still have one more trip. Got back from Okinawa, and we went to Somalia in December of '92.
Okay.
Operation Restore Hope.
All right. So to go out there, are you going to be in a carrier or?
We were land-based.
Okay.
They did the same thing. We broke up aircraft, put them on C-5As, and we flew to Somalia.
Okay. And what kind of facility or base did you have there?
Initially, we were at the port to get the aircraft built up. Eventually, we relocated out to the international airport, which really, aside from the buildings, didn't really exist anymore with everything that had gone on. But we were out there. We operated out of the international airport, or what was left of it.
Okay. So what kind of facilities did you have there? Were you living in tents or?
Yes. In fact, both in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Somalia, above my tent flew the flag of the state of Michigan. It was presented to me by, my mom lived in Melvindale, and the city councilman got it flown over the state capitol and then sent to me. So I made sure to fly it, and I have pictures of it.
Very good. All right. And so what was going on? I mean, in Somalia, what are you seeing? What are you doing?
The first reason we were there was to help the Red Cross. The International Red Cross was having so much trouble getting aid to the people because of these warlords.
Right.
They would hold them up for contraband, and by the time they get in country, they'd have pretty much nothing left. So our primary mission at first was to help the Red Cross do its job. And of course, when you got Marine Cobra helicopters and Marine Humvees with machine guns, there wasn't a whole lot of arguments from the warlords. We were able to start getting food out to the people. That was the main thing. I don't know if our job was to interfere with the warlords or that was higher above my pay grade. I just took care of the aircraft. But I'm sure there was other things we were supposed to do there, but that was kind of obvious. The Red Cross needed that assistance.
Okay. And were there people from other countries there?
Yes. In fact, on the other side of the airport was an Australian detachment. We used to trade MRE meals.
Okay.
There was also Sudanese. I'm not sure, but they were to the south of us. In fact, they caught a couple of individuals trying to sneak in with weapons. So they were kind of being perimeter security for all of us operating out of the airfield. I think it was, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was. And we met them a couple times, met a couple others, some Canadians.
Okay. And were you there when the Black Hawk Down incident took place?
No, we had already left by then.
Okay. All right. So while you were there, was it relatively quiet or not a lot of shooting going on? Or?
There was an occasional incident. When we first got there, there was an incident where a local tried to rush the main gate with an old World War II rifle. Of course, you got Marines on the main gate, and they're like, but he did actually hit the tail of one of the C-5s, so they had to stop him. They figure he was either on drugs or something to do something that silly.
Yeah.
But for the most part, most of the issues were out. I mean, no matter where you go, there's going to always be some.
And was that physically the worst assignment you had, or was Saudi Arabia worse? Or?
That was the worst assignment. Anywhere else we went, even Saudi Arabia, I did spend some time where we would have basically liberty. and you could see a little bit. And there was the local food. Obviously, you're not going to try any of the local food there because there was no anything.
Yeah.
You lived on your MREs. And I think because it was so close to my retirement, and the fact that this country was just shambles. You got all these warlords, and all they're doing is basically fighting each other and fighting their own people for their power. They didn't care about anything else.
Yeah. So getting out and visiting the country is not really an option there.
No, you're not. That would have probably been your death warrant, personally, personal opinion.
Yeah. Okay. So when do you get out of Somalia then?
Got back in April of '93.
Okay. And then you retire.
July.
Okay. So now you're sort of on the way out. Now, was it sort of standard for Marine Corps enlisted to serve 20 years if you're going to be a career person, or would people go longer than that?
It's kind of based on rank by DOD. Each rank, now as a staff sergeant, 20 years is the max you're allowed.
Okay.
Gunny can go longer, and then a master sergeant or first sergeant could go even longer. It's not uncommon, a lot, especially if you spend it all in the fleet where you're gone a lot like I was. It's not uncommon after 20 years you're kind of worn out.
Right.
So a lot of them would call it quits at that point. And there's others that some have stayed in only their 4 years, some have stayed in 8, some. Then one guy I knew, he was in for 15 years and called it quits. That's an individual thing.
Okay. Now, did you have prospects to go higher or get another promotion, or was that not really in line for you with what you were doing?
There was always the prospects, because you would go in front of the boards and they would review. I didn't get it the first time. That happens. But again, the 20 years I was kind of worn out.
Okay.
I'll be honest about it.
All right. So once you do get out, what do you do next?
Well, first off, coming back in April and then leaving in July, there wasn't a lot of planning available.
Right.
But so we were able to put our stuff out there in California in storage. Military put it in storage. And then we went cross country and ended up in Detroit, because that's where the wife's family and my mom were living. Kind of hit or miss. Now, luckily, of course, got out. Had time once we got back. Now, job situation, there wasn't a whole lot there, not in the Detroit area. So I was down Tennessee a couple times because we thought about settling down there, because most of my wife's family is from Tennessee, because that's where she was born.
Okay.
But one day I'm looking in the papers and there was quite a few jobs up in this area, so I thought, I'll give it a shot. I come up here for a couple days, stayed at what was the Holiday Inn at Ann Street. It's now independent. And I kind of liked it. I had never been here before. But I figured, you know what, I better bring the family up, see what they think before I make this decision, because this is going to be. And they liked it, and we stayed. And we've been here ever since.
Okay, so who'd you work for?
For the first couple months, I worked for Spartan Foods at their warehouse. I was a security guard.
Okay.
Then I went to work for Brinks, Armored Car Service. And I worked with them until I retired in 2015.
Okay. So you didn't go into anything aviation related or anything like that?
I did eventually work my way up to their ATM manager, so I was dealing with electronics a lot.
So you worked it that way. All right. And to look back at your career in the service, I mean, overall, what do you think you took out of that, or how did that affect you?
Well, one of the big things, it gave me a perspective to look at both sides of a coin. You know, you go to these countries and you hear stories, or even here in the States, you hear stories, but you only hear their side of the story. I kind of learned to see both sides of the coin. You know, you hear the person complaining about something, you hear the person that's for that same thing that this person's against, but you kind of learn to be able to pull out the common denominators and see, yeah, I understand what you're saying, I understand what you're saying, but maybe we need to do this to make it work. I think that was the biggest thing. and learning wherever you go. Always visit and enjoy. You'll be surprised how friendly people are. And I'm not talking governments or tourist traps. I'm talking get out. I think those are the two biggest things.
All right. Well, it makes a pretty good story, so thanks for coming in and sharing it today.
Yeah. You want to hear one good story? This is one that I've talked about a lot. Of course, we worked on the aircraft. They would have discrepancies. A friend of mine, when they did the specializing, he ended up in the OV-10 squadron, observation squadron. And they had a pilot from a jet declare an emergency at the base we were at. Emergency landing. He was down in the airplane and he taxied over. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but basically when he wrote up the gripe and the avionics shop looked at it and they showed it to the maintenance officer, the pilot was in a little bit of hot water because he had written up that the radar altimeter on his jet would not work in inverted flight.
What does that
The
mean?
radar altimeter, it sends a radar signal from one antenna down to the ground to bounce up into another antenna to tell the jet how high off the ground he is.
Right.
Inverted flight, he's flying upside down.
Okay.
We're trying to figure out what he planned to bounce that signal off of if he's upside down. But that's why the training. It wasn't that he didn't know what he was doing, it's just he probably never paid attention before. And we had maintenance people that would make those kind of, you'd think, well, that's kind of dumb. Well, that's why we train.
Okay. So he really didn't even know how his own system worked, so that if you are trying to bounce something off of the sky, maybe that doesn't work so well.
Yeah. But there's the reason for training. And then the other thing I learned is don't always assume or memorize. They actually taught us not to memorize things in the military. They taught us to use the manuals, use the books. He said the processes might not change, and the one instructor spelled it out. He says, okay, you got a rotor head. That rotor head holds 6 rotor blades. Each of those blades has 14 bolts, let's say. He said, I'm not going to give you exact numbers. I'm just using this as an example. Now let's say, according to the book, you have to torque each one of those bolts 1,000 foot-pounds because this head's turning. He says, okay, you memorize it. That's how you do it every day, every day, every day. Now, a year from now, the company that makes this aircraft realizes 1,000 ain't right. Maybe it's supposed to be 2,000, or maybe it's supposed to be only 800, but you're still doing 1,000. Now you're risking that crew and those troops' lives. So we're always taught to use books, to read, to pay attention, not just to automatically do it. And I think those are the biggest things.
Okay. All right then. Thank you.
Thank you. This was interesting.